I have watched empires convince themselves that geography is permanent, that proximity equals control, that borders drawn on maps reflect the true movement of power. I have seen this assumption destroy civilizations that believed their neighbors would remain forever dependent. What happened in the Canadian Arctic between 2025 and 2026 was not supposed to be possible. A middle power does not simply decide to restructure continental economics. A resource supplier does not casually redirect the flow of global energy. A quiet neighbor does not wake up one morning and choose to break an 80-year relationship that has defined North American power. Yet this is precisely what occurred. And most people still think they are watching a trade dispute. The public narrative remains manageable. Canada invested $180 billion in Arctic infrastructure development. The Hudson Bay Railway received thermal upgrades. The Port of Churchill expanded its grain terminals. These sound like routine infrastructure projects, the kind of spending announcements that generate brief headlines before disappearing into bureaucratic implementation. This interpretation misses everything that matters. I have studied enough dying empires to recognize the moment when a subordinate relationship quietly becomes a partnership of equals, when a resource colony transforms into a resource power, when geography stops serving the dominant partner and begins serving the patient one. The $180 billion was never about infrastructure. It was about independence. Consider the mathematics that American strategists somehow failed to calculate. The United States imports 4.3 million barrels of Canadian oil daily. This crude is specifically heavy oil, designed for refineries in Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, and Wisconsin that cannot process lighter domestic alternatives without retooling costs exceeding $40 billion. Canadian electricity powers 60% of American energy imports. Canadian aluminum and steel comprise 25% of American industrial inputs. For 80 years, this dependency remained invisible because Canada had no alternatives. American markets were the only markets. American ports were the only ports. American currency was the only currency that mattered for global trade. The Arctic investment changed this calculation permanently. The Port of Churchill, dismissed for decades as economically irrelevant, sits 6,400 kilometers closer to European markets than traditional Atlantic routes. The Hudson Bay Railway, that single line of track running through frozen wilderness to the Arctic Ocean, suddenly became the shortest path between Canadian resources and global buyers who no longer needed American permission to trade. When the first post-Panamax container ship docked in Churchill in September 2025, carrying Canadian wheat destined for Hamburg, the symbolism was unmistakable. North American trade no longer required American oversight. Canadian resources could reach world markets through Canadian territory, using Canadian infrastructure, priced in currencies other than American dollars. This is where history always turns, not through dramatic declarations or military confrontations, but through quiet infrastructure decisions that redirect the flow of commerce away from established centers toward emerging ones. Rome did not fall when barbarians crossed the frontier. Rome fell when trade routes began bypassing Roman territory, when Mediterranean commerce found alternatives to Roman ports, when the economic logic that sustained Roman power gradually shifted to other regions. The collapse came years after the redirection began. Most Romans never noticed until it was complete. American strategists made the classical error of believing that proximity guaranteed permanent advantage, that sharing the world's longest undefended border meant Canada could never seriously threaten to redirect its economic relationships, that geographic integration automatically translated into political subordination. They forgot that Canada is not just America's northern neighbor. Canada is a maritime power with access to Atlantic, Pacific, and Arctic shipping routes. As global trade patterns shift toward Asia and Europe, Canada's oceanic connections become more valuable than its land border with America. The timing reveals the sophistication of Canadian planning. The Arctic investment began precisely as American trade policy became weaponized, as tariffs and sanctions demonstrated that economic relationships with America carried political costs that many countries preferred to avoid. Canada positioned itself as the alternative, not to American goods, but to American leverage. When China needed wheat, Canadian grain could ship directly from Churchill to Shanghai without touching American territory. When Europe required energy, Canadian hydroelectricity could flow through Halifax terminals using euro-denominated contracts that bypassed dollar clearing systems. When India sought potash, Canadian fertilizer could reach Mumbai through Arctic routes that eliminated American intermediaries entirely. Each transaction represented dollars that no longer flowed through American banks, relationships that no longer provided America with monitoring capabilities, leverage that quietly transferred from Washington to Ottawa. The psychological transformation was immediate and irreversible. For the first time since 1945, major trade flows began moving around American infrastructure rather than through it. Canadian exporters discovered they could reach global markets without American permission. Canadian importers learned they could source goods without dollar intermediation. This confidence translated into momentum. When American authorities threatened countries for reducing dollar usage, those countries pointed to Canada as proof that alternatives were profitable. When American banks raised transaction fees, international businesses referenced Canadian clearing systems as competitive options. When American policymakers demanded compliance with sanctions, trading partners noted that Canadian routes offered political neutrality. The network effects accelerated beyond any American ability to contain them. Australia announced plans to join Canadian multilateral settlement systems. Norway began exploring direct trade relationships through Canadian Arctic infrastructure. Switzerland commenced feasibility studies for euro-denominated commodity purchases via Canadian ports. The United States, which had spent decades treating economic relationships as extensions of foreign policy, suddenly discovered that their most important neighbor had built the infrastructure to survive economic separation. The irony was profound. In attempting to strengthen American leverage through tariffs and trade pressure, Washington had actually accelerated Canadian independence by providing political justification for economic diversification that might otherwise have taken decades to implement. American refineries still needed Canadian oil, but Canadian oil no longer needed American refineries. American manufacturers still required Canadian aluminum, but Canadian aluminum could now command premium prices from Asian buyers. American utilities still depended on Canadian electricity, but Canadian electricity could generate higher returns from European customers willing to pay for renewable energy access. The relationship had been fundamentally inverted. America retained the dependency while Canada gained the alternatives. This inversion explains why the $180 billion represented a gamble that had already succeeded before most observers understood what was being wagered. Canada was not risking economic isolation by building Arctic infrastructure. Canada was guaranteeing economic independence by creating options that eliminated the possibility of isolation. The infrastructure was permanent, the trade relationships were sticky, the psychological confidence was irreversible. Even if future American administrations offered to return to previous arrangements, the diversification would not simply disappear. The Canadian executive, who had spent 2 years developing relationships with Vietnamese buyers, would not abandon them for the convenience of American customers. More importantly, trust had been broken. In international relations, trust is the most valuable currency. When you treat a partner like a potential enemy, when you weaponize economic relationships for political theater, when you classify your neighbor's basic industrial products as national security threats, you do not get to simply reset the relationship when it becomes convenient. What we witnessed was the birth of a new kind of power. Not the power of military dominance or financial manipulation, but the power of geographic patience combined with resource abundance and strategic infrastructure investment. Canada controlled the world's longest coastline, 20% of global freshwater, and increasingly the keys to Arctic passages that would define 21st century trade routes. The warming Arctic had transformed Canada's northern territories from frozen barriers into highways. The Northwest Passage, blocked by ice for most of human history, now offered shipping routes that cut thousands of kilometers off journeys between Europe and Asia. Unlike the Suez Canal or Panama Canal, which could be blocked or controlled by hostile powers, the Northwest Passage ran through Canadian territorial waters. This geographic advantage was becoming a geoeconomic weapon. Every ship that refueled at Churchill, every ton of wheat loaded at Hudson Bay terminals, strengthened Canada's legal claim to Arctic sovereignty while demonstrating the commercial viability of northern routes. Theoretical map lines were becoming physical reality supported by infrastructure investment and international trade flows. The United States found itself in the unprecedented position of being economically dependent on a country it had chosen to treat as a subordinate. American refineries needed Canadian oil. American manufacturers needed Canadian aluminum. American agriculture needed Canadian fertilizer. This dependency was manageable when Canada had no alternatives. It became a strategic vulnerability when Canada could sell to the highest bidder in global markets. The transformation was complete before American policymakers understood what had occurred. The quiet neighbor to the north, which had been content to remain in America's economic orbit, had been pushed into building its own gravitational field. The assumption that proximity guaranteed subordination had been replaced by the reality that proximity without alternatives meant mutual dependence between equals. Canada had proven that a middle power armed with patient strategy, abundant resources, and strategic infrastructure investment could reshape the balance of an entire continent. The $180 billion was not a gamble. It was an investment in sovereignty that had already paid permanent dividends. By the time this is fully understood, the rebalancing will be irreversible. The infrastructure is built. The relationships are established, the precedent is set. Geography has reasserted itself over assumptions, and the continent will never return to its previous configuration. History does not ask permission before it changes direction. It only records which powers adapted and which powers assumed their advantages were permanent. The financial markets understood before the politicians did. By late 2025, investment flows began reflecting a fundamental reassessment of North American risk profiles. Foreign capital that had automatically flowed toward American infrastructure projects started examining Canadian alternatives. The logic was inescapable. Why invest in ports that could be subjected to political interference when Arctic terminals offered stable, neutral access to the same global markets? Canadian government bonds strengthened against American treasuries for the first time since the 1960s. This was not currency speculation. This was institutional recognition that Canadian sovereignty had become measurable in concrete economic terms. Pension funds, sovereign wealth managers, and multinational corporations were quietly recalibrating their exposure to continental political risk. The shift accelerated through mechanisms that American strategists had never considered relevant to bilateral relationships. When Saudi Arabia began purchasing Canadian agricultural products with yuan rather than dollars, the transaction bypassed American financial surveillance entirely. When European utilities signed 20-year contracts for Canadian hydroelectricity priced in euros, they eliminated exchange rate volatility while reducing dependence on American monetary policy decisions. Each bilateral arrangement strengthened Canada's position while creating precedents that other middle powers could adapt. Argentina began accepting yuan for soybeans, pointing to Canadian precedent. Brazil explored rupee payments for coffee, citing Canadian multilateral settlement systems. Australia considered euro-denominated iron ore contracts, referencing Canadian success in currency diversification. The demonstration effect was spreading beyond North America, beyond resources, beyond traditional allied relationships. Canada had proven that monetary independence was achievable for any country willing to build necessary infrastructure and accept temporary transition costs. The Canadian model offered a template for reducing dollar dependency without embracing Chinese authoritarianism or European regulatory complexity. This proliferation of alternatives created cascading effects that compounded American vulnerabilities. As more countries developed non-dollar trading relationships, the network value of dollar-denominated commerce decreased. American banks reported declining international transaction fees. Federal Reserve data showed reduced global demand for dollar reserves. Wall Street firms specializing in currency exchange watched their Canadian business disappear as direct bilateral settlement eliminated dollar intermediation. Meanwhile, Canada's economy demonstrated that independence generated prosperity rather than isolation. Canadian exporters reported higher profit margins due to reduced currency conversion costs and elimination of American financial intermediaries. Canadian importers benefited from more stable, predictable pricing relationships with suppliers who no longer faced dollar volatility or American regulatory interference. The psychological impact extended far beyond trade statistics. International businesses gained confidence in conducting major transactions without dollar dependency. This confidence translated into permanent behavioral changes. The Vietnamese manufacturer who learned to purchase Canadian aluminum with dong would not revert to dollar transactions simply because American policymakers changed their approach. The agricultural transformation revealed the full scope of Canadian strategic thinking. Canada produces 13% of global wheat exports and dominates world markets for canola, pulses, and potash. For decades, these commodities had been priced exclusively in dollars, forcing international buyers to accumulate American currency regardless of their preferred trading relationships. Canadian agricultural reforms eliminated this dollar requirement while creating powerful incentives for bilateral cooperation. Chinese purchasers of Canadian canola paid with yuan, reducing transaction costs for both parties while strengthening currency relationships that bypassed American oversight. European buyers of Canadian wheat used euros, eliminating exchange rate risks that had previously added volatility to food import planning. The cumulative effect represented a fundamental challenge to dollar hegemony in commodity markets. For the first time since Bretton Woods, major agricultural exporters demonstrated that dollar pricing was a choice rather than a natural law. Other commodity producers watched Canadian success with intense interest, calculating whether they possessed sufficient market power to demand alternative currency arrangements. The mining sector completed Canada's resource independence strategy. Canadian deposits of lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth elements had become essential for renewable energy technology and electric vehicle production. Historically, these strategic materials had been priced in dollars, giving American financial institutions leverage over countries seeking to develop advanced technology industries. Canadian mining reforms eliminated this leverage while creating incentives for technological cooperation. When France purchased Canadian uranium with euros, both countries benefited from stable, predictable pricing without exchange rate complications. When Japan acquired Canadian lithium with yen, both parties avoided the surveillance and fees associated with dollar clearing systems. When India bought Canadian rare earth elements with rupees, both nations strengthened bilateral relationships while reducing dependence on American financial infrastructure. The energy implications were equally profound and strategically decisive. Canada supplied essential inputs to American energy security while developing the capability to redirect those supplies to higher bidders in global markets. This asymmetric relationship had been invisible when Canada lacked alternatives. It became a strategic vulnerability when Canadian energy could command premium prices from Asian and European customers. The pricing differential was deliberate and pointed. European utilities purchased Canadian hydroelectricity at preferential rates when transactions used euros. Asian manufacturers acquired Canadian natural gas at discounts unavailable to dollar-paying customers. The message was unmistakable. Canada would reward countries that supported monetary diversification while maintaining market rates for those that insisted on dollar transactions. American border communities experienced the human cost of their government's miscalculation. Towns like Bellingham and Plattsburgh that had thrived on Canadian cross-border shopping watched retail revenues collapse as Canadian consumers chose domestic alternatives or redirected spending toward countries that offered reciprocal respect. Hotels in border states reported occupancy rates falling to levels not seen since the 2008 financial crisis. The economic pain was immediate and politically significant. Republican governors in affected states publicly broke with administration trade policy. The American Trucking Association, representing an industry that moves $738 billion annually, issued statements calling tariff policies economically destructive. When your own party's regional leaders are calling your signature policy a disaster, you have lost control of the political narrative. American refineries faced particularly acute pressure as Canadian energy tariffs raised input costs by $18 per barrel overnight. These costs could not be absorbed by facilities already operating on thin margins. They were passed directly to American consumers, adding 41 cents per gallon to gasoline prices in swing states like Ohio and Michigan. The political consequences were swift and brutal. American industrial policy was literally taxing American consumers to punish their closest neighbor. The strategic genius of Canadian timing became apparent as these pressures intensified. By launching infrastructure investment during American trade aggression, Canada positioned itself as the reasonable alternative to both American monetary hegemony and Chinese authoritarianism. Countries seeking to reduce dollar exposure without embracing yuan dependency found in Canada a democratic, stable partner that offered genuine cooperation rather than replacement hegemony. The technological dimension added depth to Canadian independence. Digital currency cooperation and blockchain settlement systems interfaced Canadian financial infrastructure with Chinese, European, and Indian monetary networks. This created redundant clearing capabilities that functioned independently of American oversight or approval. Canadian businesses gained access to payment systems that operated outside traditional banking networks controlled by American regulatory authorities. This technological diversification reinforced independence while providing templates for other countries seeking monetary sovereignty without sacrificing technological sophistication. The long-term implications extended beyond immediate economic benefits into the foundations of sustained growth that operated independently of American approval. Currency agreements, clearing systems, and settlement mechanisms would generate benefits for decades. More importantly, they demonstrated to other middle powers that alternatives to monetary subordination were not only possible but profitable. Australia, Norway, and Switzerland observed Canadian success with growing interest. They understood that the traditional choice between dollar dependency and international isolation served American rather than global interests. Canadian precedent suggested that skillful middle powers could achieve independence without sacrificing prosperity. This is the new reality that most observers have yet to recognize. Canada is no longer a peripheral participant in an American-dominated financial system. Canada has become an independent monetary power with global reach, strategic vision, and the demonstrated capability to pursue national interests without seeking permission from Washington. The $180 billion Arctic investment was not a gamble on uncertain outcomes. It was a calculated restructuring of continental power relationships that has already succeeded beyond any realistic American ability to reverse. The infrastructure is operational. The trade flows are established. The psychological transformation is complete. When I observe the scope of what Canada achieved between 2025 and 2026, I see something that transcends normal diplomatic or economic change. I see a middle power that refused to accept limitations others tried to impose. I see a nation that leveraged geographic advantages and resource wealth to create options that seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. The age of Canadian financial sovereignty has begun, and those who assumed it could never happen are still trying to understand what they failed to prevent.